It's crazy to think about just how large of a phenomenon Splatoon has become in the realm of Nintendo. It's pretty rare for a new in-house Nintendo IP to skyrocket to the top of the charts, yet even on Nintendo's low-selling Wii U, this colorful 4v4 online shooter broke records for a new franchise on a failing console. It was a no-brainer that newer entries on the next Nintendo console, the Switch, would become one of the best sellers on the system, with one of the most dedicated communities that I have ever seen. I adored Splatoon when it was new. It was one of the most addictive games in the genre I had ever played. I poured many hours into Splatoon on the Wii U when I'd get home from school, and Splatoon 2 on the Switch when I'd go on family road trips. I had as much interest in it as Super Smash Bros., which is saying a lot. That being said, as more games continuously dropped on the Switch, my interest in Splatoon began to fizzle out. Lobbies would become flooded with extremely high-ranking players, and anyone jumping into the game could get absolutely slapped. My attention had shifted on other franchises like Paper Mario, Metroid, Pikmin, and many more. When Splatoon 3 got announced for the Switch, I didn't really know what to think. The gap between games was technically the largest it had ever been, yet it still strangely felt way too soon for another game. As more info would drop, I would question more and more why they even bothered with another sequel on the same console when Splatoon 2 still had active players. Despite my previous adoration for the franchise, I didn't end up picking up Splatoon 3 on launch. I bought it the day after. I just couldn't resist seeing what the new game was all about, with all my friends religiously playing the game to climb the ranks as they did in Splatoon 2. However, I had next to no interest in the multiplayer aspect of Splatoon 3. I had interest in what the latest single-player offering was all about. Splatoon is a heavily online-focused franchise, but since Nintendo is a more traditional gaming company than most others in the industry, they want a reason for these games to be purchased even if you have no access to the internet. This is where the less talked about aspect of the game, the single-player, comes into play with these releases. Tucked away quite literally in the corner of all three games are adventures with levels packed with challenges, stories fleshing out the world of the series, and bosses testing the mechanics of the main game. I recently decided to pick up a used copy of Splatoon on the Wii U to see what the game was like after the recent shutdown of all the online services of the Wii U and Nintendo 3DS. Without the turf war battles, shop with fresh fashion, and thriving community posts roaming around the plaza, these are what these games will leave behind when their servers get shut down for good. After admittingly losing interest in the series after I was sort of burnt out by Splatoon 3, I decided to pick up Splatoon 1 again to see if I could rediscover what made me fall in love with the series in the first place. Then I played every other campaign afterwards, and now I have a lot to say. Well, that's what video essays are for. Join me as we take a look at every piece of single-player content that the Splatoon franchise has to offer. We're going to see just how well Splatoon shines when you aren't playing Turf War with 7 other players around the globe. I'm Ryder, and you're listening to a Splatoon single-player retrospective.
Everyone 10 and up.
Splatoon is truly a one-of-a-kind game. It's apparent right as you play through the tutorial that there isn't anything quite like it in the market. The core of the game is an ink-based shooter where you cover the ground with your team's ink, and you play as a squid-based creature called an inkling who can swim through said ink on the ground for higher speeds or on the walls for vertical movement. When taking your first step into Inkopolis Plaza, a news report from the celebrity duo, the Squid Sisters, warns that the Great Zapfish has been stolen, meaning the town will run out of power in due time. This does serve as a setup for the campaign, but the game certainly nudges you to get your feet inked in Turf War along with visiting the numerous other shops in the plaza. The campaign is more so mentioned as a suspicious little secret that is tucked to the side. Unfortunately for the game, the Wii U servers have been discontinued, so this campaign is the only piece of content that this game has to show. Meet Captain Cuttlefish, the leader of the new Squidbeak Splatoon, and he tells you all about how the Octarians have returned and how we're gonna be at war with them in this adventure. So with absolutely zero approval or denial of helping in the matter, we're off to slaughter the Octarians and hopefully recover the great Zapfish that was stolen. It doesn't take long for the game to get started, thankfully. The story on a surface level is pretty straight to the point, with a lot more depth that I'll touch on a bit later. Before diving into the actual levels, I'd like to point out how large of a contrast the hub environments are in the single player compared to the rest of Splatoon. The main multiplayer modes are colorful, full of attitude and fresh style. Stepping into the Octo Valley, however, treats you with this large canyon. The colors are a bit less saturated, and revealing new levels plays an ominous opening sound effect. The music is significantly atmospheric and pulls back on the more modern instruments. All of this makes the campaign show that outside of the competitive nature of the turf wars, there is a deep conflict happening outside of it all that not a lot of folks are really paying any attention to. It kind of gives off this lonely vibe that really isn't apparent anywhere else in the game, which kind of makes sense when you think about how it's the single player mode. Kind of genius, actually. Launching into the first level, the campaign's level structure goes for an interesting platform shooter hybrid. Most levels will test your navigational capabilities as a squid while throwing in simple shooter combat with the different Octarian enemies. Splatoon isn't the most fast-paced shooter out there, but key components of it is that navigation is significantly sped up through the use of the squid form using the ink that you've turfed onto the ground. When there's a large chunk of platforming in the levels in the campaign, the game's pacing revolves a lot more around the mobility and speed of the Inkling. To its benefit, the combat is able to complement these levels by keeping enemy types simple to understand and very quick to defeat so you can get back into the action. Enemies will splat in less than a second with proper aiming, and it really benefits the pacing and makes sense due to how quickly you can get defeated in Splatoon. A lot of campaigns and shooters, even those with an emphasis on platforming, have hordes of enemies with giant health bars that make every single foe really sluggish to defeat. Splatoon is able to be free of this problem that I have with other shooter campaigns by spacing the enemies out effectively throughout the levels and leaves combat a quick yet satisfying process. Due to this design philosophy, the level design is able to take advantage of enemy mechanics and integrate them into the different gimmicks in creative ways. As an example, there will be levels with a sponge platform that increases in size when you shoot it with ink, mostly used to create bridges to cross gaps and climb walls. After establishing this mechanic, they then throw Octarians into the mix, who are able to shrink the platforms with their shots. This increases the tension of platforming with the sponges, yet they also find creative ways to integrate the enemies as core mechanics, as the level's hidden sunken scroll will challenge you to use shots of an enemy to shrink an inked sponge to reveal a hidden grate below to slip under the platform and nap the scroll. This design mentality is found throughout a majority of the levels in Splatoon. Other levels will use assets from the main game to create more combat-focused levels. In every world after the first one, there is one level dedicated to launching you into one of the multiplayer maps and having you reach the other side while enemy Octolings ambush you, behaving similarly to Inklings, which bring a hint of the PvP nature of the main game into the single player. Other times, they'll also use multiplayer maps for Octo Striker levels, very similar in structure to the Octoling levels, but there's Octarians flooding the level instead, while ink strikes constantly get rained on you. I don't find these as interesting as the Octolings flooding the level, but they're sort of a nice break from the lengthy platforming levels. Then there are the boss fights. Similar to its approach in level design and enemy design, bosses are far more tailored to the nature of the Inkling. Shooter bosses can typically be seen with massive health bars, having you dodge attack patterns while whittling down their health with every single bullet. Splatoon's bosses are more akin to a 3D Mario boss where it tests your knowledge of the game's mechanics while providing a spectacle. The first boss is incredibly basic, but tests your knowledge effectively on navigation using the squid form by scaling its side while it's face down on the floor to attack the tentacle on its back. Other bosses will test your aim, escaping a crisis, or my favorite example being a giant spherical boss performing a spin dash to run you over. But you need to learn that turfing the ground will slow it down, and submerging it in ink will halt it to a complete stop and reveal its weak point. Then later phases will have parts of the ground rotating and even removed entirely, making turfing much harder. These bosses are certainly fascinating puzzles, though the fights themselves lack a certain tension that other shooter and platformer bosses provide that hinder the enjoyment of these fights. They can lead to cool aha moments, but once you know how to defeat them, they tend to feel like going through the motions instead of a proper challenge. Except for the final boss, which I'll touch on later. Aside from the unique mechanics that each new level brings, this is precisely what the single player offers in Splatoon. It feels like a breath of fresh air when coming off of other shooter campaigns. It manages to feel distinct in a way that I can see anyone getting into, even if shooters aren't their preferred genre. One more thing I'd like to cover is the narrative side of the single player. It's relatively tucked away, but it provides a lot of interesting world building that elevates the single player to being a unique experience. In a way, it's as tucked away as the single player is to the main multiplayer focus of the game. Each level has a hidden sunken scroll piece that are each usually pretty easy to find, with the occasional spark of clever mechanisms used to hide them. These heavily dive deep into the origin of the Inklings, the world, and the backstory of several characters throughout the game. Another interesting tidbit is that after every world, you'll hear from Cuttlefish on the radio for some dialogue mainly used to progress the story. These are weirdly ominous, as there's no music during these, and later on in the game, a mysterious threatening signal will start intervening in the audio. After World 3, this mysterious figure kidnaps, squid naps Captain Cuttlefish, leaving you on your own for a little bit, until the signal of Agent 1 and 2 come in to assist you on your adventure to save Cuttlefish, as he is their Gramps. And I could just be crazy, but they look awfully... I have no idea who these two are. The last two worlds spice things up quite a bit by introducing new enemies like Octo Snipers. They reuse level gimmicks in a bit more challenging way, and Octolings will start showing up in the platforming levels more frequently, with the Octoling stages actually introducing a new variant of the foes that will make them far more skilled and advanced. But other than the slight advances to level design towards the end of the game, things are relatively straightforward and easy to overcome throughout the adventure. The game's about as easy as your average Nintendo game, with bits of do-or-die challenges sprinkled in there. That is, until the final boss. They really upped the ante for the final fight. The villain, DJ Octavio, uses the Great Zapfish to power up his machine and gives us by far the most engaging battle in the game. As he flexes his wasabi beats on the mixtape, he'll constantly shoot a barrage of rockets at you to keep you on edge. When he fires his giant robot fists, you need to shoot at them for long enough to fire them back at Octavio to push him further back through the stage, avoiding the bottomless pit along the way through the different gizmos you've interacted with throughout the game, until you back him into a corner where he starts firing a giant torpedo at you that you have to play tennis with him Ganondorf style until it lands a hit on him, and proceeds to the next phase of the battle. Each phase, he introduces more attacks to make the fight intense, like spawning Octarians, firing 4 rockets at once, and having a giant killer whale to avoid. Once you make the torpedo land on him 3 times, the final phase begins where Agent 1 and 2 override DJ Octavio's mixtapes and starts playing the theme of the Squid Sisters, as the arena turns into a ginormous rave party and makes the fight so much more climactic and intense. It really turns this fight into something awesome, as DJ Octavio throws everything in his arsenal at you on platforms that are extremely hard to work with. Aside from what the main multiplayer has to offer, this fight is an excellent showcase of what Splatoon is, using every bit of knowledge you have to survive this onslaught and blast Octavio into an ink explosion. I remember how effective this boss was for me when the game was released nearly a decade ago, and its whole vibe is one of the reasons why I ended up loving this series in the first place. It truly was, and still is, unlike anything Nintendo had ever put out at the time. Across the whole of the game, this single player helped solidify Splatoon's identity and place in the Nintendo family of franchises. It offers a unique experience for players that take a liking to more advanced games like shooters, while also making it fun and fresh for those that aren't particular fans of the genre. I love Splatoon, and while its multiplayer is long gone in an official capacity, its single-player campaign will always serve as a reminder of some of the most fun I had on the Wii U. Splatoon 2 exists in a fascinating context. When the first game was released, Nintendo had already been making plans for the next console they would release due to the Wii U's failure. Not even a year after the first game finished its final Splatfest, the Nintendo Switch was revealed to the public through an extremely gripping advertisement. And in that video, a few short clips of a Splatoon game running on the new system were shown, mostly in this massive stadium. I guess Nintendo wanted Splatoon to become an esport or something. It was either speculated that this would be an enhanced port of the original game, like was shown for Mario Kart 8 in that advertisement, or a full-blown sequel due to the new animations and radically different hairstyles that were shown. Not long into January 2017, we'd find out that it was, in fact, a sequel with new weapons and mechanics. No footage was shown of the single-player offering at the time, but there was this mysterious shot of Marie wearing a new outfit in the Octo Canyon. Seems awfully suspicious, considering the end of the Splatfest in Splatoon 1 landed in her victory. In the full release, Marie is the mentor character this time around in the campaign to not only help stop the Octarians and save the Squidnap Great Zapfish once more, but to also find her cousin Callie. Leading up to the game's release, there were some interesting comic teasers that would be posted showcasing the events before the game's story and sharing how Callie ended up going missing. What's interesting about this is that it introduced a very interesting piece of community continuity into the series by having the results of a competitive event have a direct impact on the story of the next game. It's actually a really fun and creative way to integrate multiplayer into the story of Splatoon and make the players feel like they have an impact on the story of the franchise. And I find it very impressive that they were able to craft a story around these results in a little over a year afterwards. Marie is a far more entertaining supporting character in the campaign, in my opinion, due to her fun comments and attitude throughout the game, combined with her occasional blatant sarcasm. She's great. I found it really fun cycling through her dialogue throughout the game in the overworld. As for the single-player campaign itself, it ends up amounting to more of the same from Splatoon 1, in all honesty. There are some changes to make it more accessible than the first game's campaign, but it doesn't feel like it does much to make it stand out from the Wii U game. To start with one of the largest improvements, there are now points where Sheldon, who is the weaponsmith, will request data with a different weapon of his to make you play said level with that specific weapon. This means that there are a few levels designed with a specific weapon in mind, which helps a bit with spicing up the variety of level design, but it doesn't go all the way with it for a reason I'll discuss later. This is still an improvement regardless. I decided to wait until now to touch on this, but in the first game, you only use the hero shot for the entire campaign that you can upgrade using power eggs that you collect from enemies and throughout the level. However, using an Inkling amiibo will let you play a large chunk of the campaign's levels with a different weapon. Scanning the Inkling girl challenges you with playing levels using the hero charger, while scanning the Inkling boy will challenge you with using the hero roller for a number of levels. The Squid Amiibo actually has 2 different challenge types for a variety of levels. One where you have to speedrun the level with a Kraken squid form, and another where you have limited ink to finish the level. All very interesting concepts, but the main problem with this is locking this content behind Amiibo. I have the Inkling boy and girl, so I'm able to do some of the challenges and get some of the unique outfits, but I do not own the Squid Amiibo, and that bit of content is inaccessible to me in the first game. Splatoon 2 is able to avoid this issue by having Sheldon's weapons integrated into the main story. It makes every new level much more interesting to jump into. Next, there are now 2 collectibles to hunt per level. The Sunken Scrolls return, and they are far more interesting to search for, usually requiring creative thinking of the game's mechanics as opposed to mostly finding them under some platform. Then there's Sardinium, which are materials that are found in areas usually just as hidden, but as opposed to hiding more content to the lore book, these are necessary materials used to upgrade all of the weapons you get in the main story. The Hero Shot is what you'll mostly use, and you'll probably want to upgrade its pathetic fire rate as soon as you can. But you can also upgrade the new weapons, get different kinds of bombs, upgrade your ink tank, etc. They do require a hefty amount of power eggs as well, so it does end up to a good amount of grinding as an extra step, but it's still pretty neat for giving more depth to the actual level design. In an interesting change to make the game a bit less punishing, there's also now armor built into the new hero suit. In Splatoon 1, you could get up to 3 extra layers of armor for the suit, but in 2, there's a max of 2 extra layers, with the first one being built in. The caveat now to make this balanced is that once you lose that armor, you're fully exposed by moving slower and always being visible, making your best option to run away from the scenario you're in until you're able to heal in a safe place to recharge your armor. The game is still relatively easy overall, so this may seem overpowered, but I found myself losing that armor quite frequently, so my assumption is that they lowered the overall health points of the armor so that taking damage makes you far more vulnerable. It ends up making the game feel ever so slightly more intense, but that could just be how the game made me feel due to the visual and sound effects. Other than those improvements, there's some stuff like overworld balloon challenges, loads of more obstacles, and gizmos like rolling platforms and grind rails that work extremely well for this game with how much shooting you do on the move, and new enemies revolving around the new content from the updates in Splatoon 1 and this game, like Octo Commanders, bowling balls, Octo Hurlers, etc. Other than that, it is certainly more Splatoon, alright. The bosses are a bit more interesting and require you to pay more attention to what's happening. I think Octo Samurai is a standout boss for this game. The rest of it really does simply feel like more of the first game though, and I'd argue that the level design can be a little strange at times. While not a massive blow to the game, there are some instances that may question new players. Take, for instance, in this level that has a main focus on these bounce pads, it effectively sets up challenges around this mechanic by providing a safe area to test the mechanic in the beginning, and ramping up the utilization of this mechanic by introducing more obstacles and enemies from previous levels to spice up the level. But then at the end, they introduced the Octo Sniper into the game for the first time and have you perform a final challenge based on this enemy you haven't seen before, which I can see scaring players who have never played Splatoon before and don't know how the enemy works. There is a later level that has the enemies in a safer environment provided you're playing the levels in numerical order, but it feels like that level should have come before this bounce pad level when ordering the levels numerically, which is the order I chose to play the stages in. Stuff like this does not ruin the level design of the game, and it's basically a non-issue to those who played the first game, but it feels like a bit of an inconsiderate level design choice. I mean, that sniper marker is freaking stressful. I panicked when I saw one of those for the first time in the first game. Most of the adventure plays things really safe, though. The game follows the exact same format of the first game to a T and doesn't really introduce enough to justify it as a new entry, aside from the obvious benefit of it being on a new console. I think this is the primary reason as to why Splatoon 2's single player is as safe as it is. When you consider the context of its release, I'm honestly still impressed that it's as polished and well made as it is. They had a little less than 2 years to put this sequel together and tie it in with the results of the final Splatoon 1 Splatfest in 2016. The small level design nitpicks I occasionally have, and how safe they played it, is likely a result of Splatoon 2 being a little rushed to meet the launch window of the Nintendo Switch. And playing it safe probably was the best option for this, since most of the audience for Splatoon 2 haven't even played the first game. At that point, you could argue that they should have just ported Splatoon 1, but then what incentive would owners of the Wii U game have to buy the game, again, with little changes? Splatoon 2 is pretty much the same game, but just more, so it'd be hard to justify putting Splatoon 1 on the Switch aside from nostalgia and preservation. Going back to the actual game, though, the game still has interesting world-building developments on a narrative and in-game level. The Sunken Scrolls provide more in-depth looks on the world of Splatoon as per usual, but two things that I like that are rather subtle are that, unlike Splatoon 1, where each new world has you ascending through Octo Valley higher and higher, Splatoon 2 has you descending lower and lower through Octo Canyon until you get down to the dark depths where you're hovering over a massive Octarian lake, which helps make the final world feel a lot more climactic. That, and as you progress more and more through the game, talking to Marie has her say more unique things internally, which is funny because she both ends up warming up to you by thinking you're adorable and complimenting your better hygiene, yet also becomes increasingly annoyed with you due to how long you talk to her and missing Agent 3. Splatoon always has fun attention to world building and character developments that I don't see very often in other franchises from the company. That final world may look climactic, but I'll tell you what isn't climactic, though. The final boss. Yeah, this one kinda blows. It's a decent fight, but doesn't compare in the slightest to the first game's finale. To be fair, I do love how jumping into the arena makes the crowd start roaring before the fight begins. Really helps to bring up the intensity of the situation. But to the surprise of no one, Callie was hypnotized by the one and only DJ Octavio, who once again uses the Great Zapfish to power his big DJ machine, and the two have a duet. The fight is still fine, it basically recycles a lot from the first game's final boss, and I do like how a remix of Callie's song plays and ends up turning into a remix of both Callie and Marie's theme once Marie swoops in to remove the hypno shades from Callie. But it all just does not hit the same as the first game's finale. It isn't even as intense. There are times where I'm just standing there waiting for Octavio to throw his next attack. The first game set such a high bar for its finale that the second game just does not meet. I think it's cool how the last phase has you use the Rainmaker to send the punches back at Octavio, ending with you slamming the Rainmaker on his head like you would in a round of ranked battle. It's a neat concept, but it just doesn't have as much juice as the first game's final boss. The same sort of ending happens as the first game too. The Great Zapfish is restored, and Callie comes back, and everyone throws a big old party. I would say that I'm done, but there is one thing that really frustrates me about this campaign that ultimately makes me prefer the first game's single player. So you're given 9 weapons in the campaign. The hero Shot, Charger, Roller, Dually, Slosher, Splatling, Blaster, Brush, and Brella. A nice variety of weapons gives a sense of choice outside of these Sheldon request stages, and when you beat a level, you can go back and use whichever weapon you want. However, like Splatoon 1 through the Amiibo challenges, you can get these weapons to use in the multiplayer. How? Well, you see, there's a tally on every level that shows what weapons you've beaten that level with. In order to get a certain weapon from the campaign to use in multiplayer, you have to beat every single level in the game with that weapon. Oh dear lord, you know where this is going. In order to 100% this campaign, you have to beat every single level with all 9 weapons. Nah, I'm good. I really hope the servers for this game don't shut down when the next system comes out, because that means getting weapons for local multiplayer is going to be a chore. I just don't have the patience to play every level in this game 9 separate times. If the game was short and replayable, then maybe I'd consider it, but this just ain't it, Chief. For what Splatoon 2 needed to accomplish, it accomplished it well. Players who didn't get to play the first game will probably get a similar level of joy that I did when playing that first game's campaign. Returning players, however, will likely get a large sense of been there, done that from this adventure. It's still good, and having it portably on the Switch is enough of a reason to play the second game after playing the first, but it's fairly uninteresting as a sequel, and I'd ultimately rather just play the first game's campaign. Splatoon 2 doesn't necessarily have a worse campaign, but the first felt like something fresh and exciting, and Splatoon 2 just didn't capture that. But I guess it didn't need to. There's a lot that Splatoon 2 wanted to do that I imagine they couldn't due to wanting to introduce a new audience to the franchise that they missed out on 2 years ago. But now that Splatoon has been established with millions of more players, now is their chance to get a little experimental with pushing the series forward. Splatoon is known for having numerous free post-launch content updates that drop steadily after each game's release. The game was already fun enough on its own, so getting more multiplayer content helped to keep the game engaging to come back to every few months. But now that we have a game with a well-established player base, let's try putting our efforts into making something truly special for fans of the series. Splatoon 2 Octo Expansion aims to fill this desire, serving as the first paid DLC in the franchise. It grants a heavily desired feature by offering playable Octolings while also making a brand new campaign that is significantly more downbeat. In Octo Expansion, you don't start by entering the new trendiest place in town looking for adventure. You're an Octoling referred to as Agent 8 by Captain Cuttlefish, completely knocked out and sent underground after something unexpected happens in a seemingly fierce battle with Agent 3, making their return from Splatoon 1. You and Captain Cuttlefish work together to escape the Deep Sea Metro, and once boarding the train after talking to this mysterious telephone, this sea cucumber named Sea Cucumber comes and says that we're in an underground facility run by Kamabo Corporation. In order to reach the Promised Land, we need to complete tests and collect the 4 things to open the door to the Promised Land. I really like the setup for this campaign, as unlike the base campaign where you're working to save Inkopolis, you're fighting for your life, trying to escape the dire circumstance set before you and getting along with everyone that comes your way. Captain Cuttlefish very much thinks you're an enemy that he has to work with in the beginning, but as you progress through the subway, he realizes that listening to Calamari Incantation has brought you to your senses and confirms that you're not an enemy. Octo Expansion really has a lot of character. It's really fun seeing Pearl and Marina from the main game meet you and Cuttlefish and learning that Pearl and Cuttlefish are heavily into rap battles. It's really charming, and I really love reading the chat logs that pop up the more you progress through the story. As you go on different lanes of the metro and progress through the story, more characters will show up, and even the variety of NPCs vary a lot as you see all of the different species that can hang out in the train. It all helps make Splatoon's world feel even larger than you think it is. I'm also happy to say that the way Octo Expansion handles its campaign is far more interesting than the previous game's single-player offerings. There isn't a massive hub world this time around, but it goes all in on the levels and their challenges. There are a whopping 80 levels in Octo Expansion, which is an insane amount of content. However, Octo Expansion's levels are a bit shorter and remove in-level collectibles to solely focus on honing the challenge of the level design, which I am perfectly happy with after the first 2 games. Another nice thing is that there is no specific main weapon in Octo Expansion, as every single level is designed with up to 3 specific weapons in mind. In the base game's campaign, they had to design levels that may specialize with specific weapons, but work with all 9 weapons throughout the campaign. Since that limitation is removed in Octo Expansion, they get to realize the weapons to their full potential. It's because of this that Octo Expansion never feels stale at any point. As for the level design itself, it's a good bit harder than both Splatoon games. Not unforgiving by any means, but it may as well feel like it thanks to Sea Cucumber. This little slob is freaking evil. There are a large chunk of levels that require you to meet certain conditions in order to pass the test. Finish a level with limited ink, push an 8-ball to the goal, dodge every obstacle, break specific crates to replicate a damn statue, and a lot more creative missions. But if you mess up on a single thing, this sticky little sludge will inflate the plastic bag on your back and make you explode. Criminy on a stick, that's harsh. But to stay real, finishing Octo Expansion isn't absurdly difficult or anything, since you don't even need to beat every single level in order to finish the game. You just have to find the 4 things on the map and play the levels needed to get to said thing. But if you want your Splatoon skills to be tested, you can absolutely make that happen. Of course, I wanted to play every level in this DLC to see what all there was to offer, but as I said before, levels are designed with up to 3 specific weapons in mind, and some of them make the level intentionally much harder to play. A great example of this is Righteous Rails Station. The level is relatively straightforward with the splatter shot, where you need to make sure you hit every target on time while managing your ink and avoiding obstacles, but using the bamboozler transforms the level. This is a slightly faster charge weapon with fairly short range. Since you're constantly on the move with the grind rails, you need to know exactly when to start charging, when to fire, and what places you can start building ink back up in. This felt like a true and intentional challenge. I had to master usage of the bamboozler to get the win on this test, and when I finally hit all 30 targets, I was incredibly satisfied. Seriously, try Righteous Rails with the bamboozler. It makes the level so much more fun. This is far from the only example of this kind of enhanced difficulty. Good lord, Matchmaster Station is something else. The recommended weapon for these kinds of levels is the Squeezer, a very precise weapon that will destroy 1 crate by tapping the trigger. Using the Rapid Blaster Pro on this is the ultimate test of precision. This thing has an explosion radius, and when you hit a target, there is splash damage that will land on the surrounding crates. Most of the time, it'll just lead to the surrounding crates getting damaged, but just you wait until you hit one that snaps a loose crate. Wait! Playing the level this way makes you far more considerate as to planning when to pick off certain orange crates and what angle to shoot them at so you don't get enough splash damage on a brown crate. As hard as it is, it's genius, and I rarely ever see Nintendo games offer this kind of challenge on an intentional level. It's so amazing to see. Closer to the end of the adventure, after dropping off another thing at the subway, there's an interesting portion where you have to remember what Agent 3 looked like, aka you're customizing your character from the first game. Very cool, maybe it'll come into play later. Once you get all 4 things, the telephone promises to open the door to the Promised Land, and this sequence is really freaky, oh my gosh. The telephone screams and makes a blender, then traps Agent 8 and Cuttlefish inside and plans to blend them. That's really freaking brutal, but luckily Agent 3 at the last second realizes that this game is rated E for everyone and breaks into the subway and decks the telephone in the face. I guess Kamabo Co. needed Octoling blood for their research, but luckily that nasty telephone is out, but Agent 3 is also out cold after probably breaking his knee. Cuttlefish stays behind to look after Agent 3 and the telephone as we proceed to the final stage. Dude, this last stage is like the coolest finale in a hot minute. Unlike the rest of the game, it's an extremely long stage with multiple different phases. The level starts with an intense stealth section where you have no means of offense and have to slip past the Kamabo Octarians undetected. There's incredibly subtle music in this section, and the audio is incredible with the way that you hear all the creaks of machinery as you go, and the engines of the Octarian vehicles rumble when you're near an enemy. But this is just the beginning of the stage. When Phase 2 begins, the signal is strong enough to the outside to be able to hear Off the Hook's song, Nasty Majesty, which is probably the greatest bit of stage music in the entire series. Combined with the action you're dealing with, it really gives off the impeccable vibe of executing a heist. The more intense instrumentation of the song really elevates this sequence when you obtain your weapons to take out all the enemies in your way. Everything in this campaign up to this point has been a test that you can either succeed or fail in, with multiple opportunities for Agent 8 to retry. But at this point, this is the make or break of the adventure. This isn't a test anymore. It's do or die. Your one chance to escape this hellhole. Though in reality, you still have infinite lives and infinite chances to overcome the level, but it's just in the story where it's treated as an actual death here, which ups the narrative stakes immensely. Nasty Majesty could really play for the entire level in all honesty, as you overcome platforming challenges and slip through a laser sequence. It's really great. But as you go through the level, it does shift to another song. Over time, the telephone comes back to life over the radio and does something mysteriously bad to Cuttlefish. As you switch on the power system of the facility, the music becomes more confident as you start tearing through the rest of the facility. Eventually, you reach the elevator to finally reach the surface and end this madness. But we're stopped by Agent 3, who is now hijacked by the Kamabo sludge, and a new boss begins where we have to take him out. This fight is pretty sick, but weirdly unsettling in a way, as a remixed version of the Splatoon 1 theme plays. Kinda feels like you're fighting yourself in some weird way. The fight isn't super hard, but it certainly utilizes all of your abilities more than any other Splatoon boss has. But eventually he's splatted and gets knocked out unconscious yet again. We free Cuttlefish and we finally reach the surface in this absolutely beautiful sequence. Off the Hook comes to pick us up and flies us away. But, I can't believe I'm about to say this, the damn Statue of Liberty arises from the water, and the telephone, being hijacked by Commander Tartar, plans to use the statue as a beam to destroy the entire world. What follows is the coolest damn final boss in the whole series. Holy moly, this sequence is incredible. Marina tells Pearl to charge her vocal cords, and she goes to drop prototype hyperbombs all over the statue, and we have to detonate them and cover the entire statue in ink. I seriously love how they not only throw a save the world sequence at us during the very end of this relatively downbeat campaign, but they play with our emotions by treating this like a damn turf war match, which is actually hilarious, just incredible. Then the actual plan initiates as you blast the hyperbombs while this incredible final boss theme from Off the Hook starts playing, and it's just everything. It's the most climactic sequence in this entire franchise, and the boss isn't even fighting back, there's just a time limit. And oh my gosh, the last minute of this is insane, where ebb and flow kicks in and you have to desperately rush to destroy the final 10 bombs before the statue destroys the entire world, and how did they do this? This boss is amazing! Then when time runs out, the statue is gonna fire anyways, but Pearl comes in and does a hyper killer whale to fire back at the laser, and the Turf War results screen comes up and yeah, it's just no contest. That thing gets obliterated. What an ending. Octo Expansion is fantastic. To this day, it's one of the best DLCs that Nintendo has ever put out. It feels like way more than a simple expansion to the base game. Everything about it just works. Wait. Actually, there's one thing I need to talk about. One last thing about Octo Expansion that is a really cool inclusion, challenge, and tribute to the series, but also drove me insane. We need to talk about the secret boss with Inner Agent 3. I am going to chokeslam this guy. Alright, so get this. Finishing all 80 levels will unlock this one final challenge, a throwback boss fight with Agent 3 that drives the difficulty up a damn wall. This fight is the hardest gosh darn challenge in any Splatoon game, and I will argue that until the ink on my pen runs out. Let's run through the list of why this boss makes Melania look like King Babam. You have an Octo Shot and a Splat Bomb, which isn't too bad, it's the basic Splatoon setup. But what does Inner Agent 3 have? Well, he cycles through 5 different specials throughout the 5 different phases of the boss fight. First phase has you deal with an ink jet, followed by a fairly harmless ink bubble, followed by a barrage of auto bombs, followed by ink strikes on a saucer, and then an unhealthy amount of splashdowns. To top that all off, his base moveset is a hero shot with auto bombs, so you're constantly being tracked by those bombs the entire fight. And for added kicks, he has a dodge roll, which you cannot do with any other weapon than the Splat Dualies. His bubble phase is pretty easy since you can easily get behind him and break his armor while he's using the bubbles, but every other phase is a pain in the neck. I can deal with all of his other phases sometimes, but his final splashdown phase is what drives me nuts. He will constantly be using it, and even when he is open in his normal shooting routine, if he's low on health, he'll just decide to use the damn splashdown as a desperation move that is very hard to react to if you're close to him. And if you're hit once in this phase, it's basically over. You move far too slowly with broken armor to escape any splashdown, so he can finish you in an instant there if he wants. The best course of action is to use this trash can as a shield to block the splashdown damage, and if you're fast enough, you can even deal damage on him in between splashdowns since you have a slight hint of an opening there. After 2 straight hours of getting lucky, I finally got the splat on him, and I was so relieved that I nearly cried. That is how long I'd attempted that fight for. You wanna know the worst part though? You want to know the part that really just makes me upset? Depending on how you play, you'll either win this fight for the first time in around 2 to even 10 hours, or you'll beat it on your 3rd damn attempt. My experience with this fight was miserable, but if you're good at PvP in this game and have really solid aim against dually players and know how to effectively not take damage, then this fight can end up being incredibly easy for you. My friend was certainly able to beat this boss 12 times back to back due to skilled PvP play. I'm just the average Splatoon player that hops on Turf War every once in a while and doesn't get that many splats, and from that perspective, I hate this boss, and I never want to touch it again. Let's not get it twisted though, Octo Expansion is still incredible. That's just one super hard final challenge that just bogged it down a slight bit for me. It's not even like it's the most impossible thing on the planet, it's still a decently fair fight. I'm just not the kind of player that can flow with a boss like that in this kind of game. What Octo Expansion was able to do for Splatoon is absolutely astounding and rekindled a lot of interest in the game for me after not touching it for a while. They really got a grip of what worked throughout the campaigns and refined that to near perfection. When the next Splatoon game comes, I'm sure they'll knock it right out of the park. I have a weird amount to say about the release of Splatoon 3. It's extremely bizarre because it feels like it came out right after the second game, but when you take a step back, it is by far the longest release in between games, even when you count content updates. When Splatoon 3 was revealed, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was excited to see the third entry come into reality, following the Chaos theme that reigned supreme at the end of the final Splatoon 2 Splatfest. Yet I was extremely conflicted seeing that this was Splatoon 3, a sequel to a game that was already on the Nintendo Switch. And the more they showed of the game, I began to question why this wasn't just an expanded DLC of Splatoon 2. Initially, I wasn't even planning on getting the game. I didn't even watch the Splatoon 3 Direct in August. I got my fill with Splatoon 2, what more could they possibly offer me? However, one thing they showed that really interested me was the single-player campaign. I was extremely curious as to how the apocalyptic chaos theme would impact the game's story, and I was fascinated by the desolate wastelands and the return of the mammalians in this weird frosty landscape. This looked like it was going to be by far the most interesting and ambitious Splatoon campaign yet, especially with the increased budget from the massive sales of Splatoon 2. So how did it turn out? Well, let's see. The beginning is probably the most gripping of the base Splatoon games. You begin by customizing your character in this rusty wasteland and by customizing your friendly small fry that joins you for the campaign. When entering the sewers to the canyon this time, Cuttlefish is with us again and refers to us as Agent 3, with the previous Agent 3 being promoted to the new leader of the new Squidbeak Splatoon. The Great Zapfish was stolen yet again. They really need better security on this thing. It starts like your everyday Splatoon campaign, going to these kettles and doing these levels as per usual, but it feels kinda by the numbers. The level design here is extremely bland and lacks that spark of creativity that the previous campaigns had in even their beginnings. However, when collecting enough power eggs now, you can use those to power up your small fry to eat this fuzzy ooze that's covering the entire ditch. But that's more of an overworld method to progress rather than something that affects the actual level design. After playing a few stages and reaching the center of the ditch, suddenly DJ Octavio comes in on a new machine and we decide to fight him because who else stole the frickin' Zapfish? This is actually the most interesting first boss in the series because it immediately starts with how these campaigns normally end, and the atmosphere is really cool looking, with it looking like we're in the middle of a giant sandstorm. I love the scenery here. Octavio is pretty easy this time around since he is the first boss, but it's still an engaging first battle. Afterwards, we interrogate him about the Zapfish, but shocker, he didn't take it. Before we find out who done it, the funny ooze spreads and we fall through a door into the massive ditch, and as we're free-falling, Cuttlefish gets abducted by the fuzzy ooze, and... that was just the tutorial. The first portion of this is pretty slow and boring, if I'm being honest, but it really picks up and recaptures interest once we land in Alterna. It appears that Kali and Amari, Agent 1 and 2 are already here alongside the new leader, so they'll be joining us for the adventure this time. So now we can begin the game for real. And it's Octo Expansion. This is just Octo Expansion. Okay. Alright, simplifying the campaign to that is a little disingenuous of me. In reality, they go for this weird hybrid between the first two games' campaigns and Octo Expansion's format, and this has its pros and cons. To get into the really interesting stuff, the hub world this time around is easily the most detailed and expansive it has ever been. In previous games, it really does serve as a means just to get to all the levels, but it feels like a prominent part of the game here. This actually reminds me of a sandbox collectathon, which I didn't think they'd go for with Splatoon. There are a lot of hidden collectibles and challenges sprinkled around the hub world that take full advantage of the design of the environment. There are no enemies in this hub world, sadly, but the main threat is this fuzzy ooze that is all over every single one of these islands. A vast majority of the time, the location you need to reach is blocked by this fuzzy ooze, and as said before, the small fry can only eat these chunks if you have enough power eggs to power him up. You can find a few power eggs hidden in areas of the hub world, but the vast majority of them are found in the levels themselves by completing them. The way levels are handled in Splatoon 3 is rather strange. There are actually two different kinds of levels. Golden Kettles serve as the traditional platforming levels where you can use your hero shot that you can upgrade via a skill tree now of all things, or whichever other weapon is offered to equip for that stage. These are solid levels, but since these are treated as the main stages, they kinda pale in comparison into Splatoon 1 and even Splatoon 2's stages. The other kind of stages are in the Silver Kettles, which are far more Octo Expansion structured. These have the typical Octo Expansion challenges like dodging attacks, sculpting with crates again, turfing an entire structure, doing a speedrun challenge, etc. I do find these around the same level as enjoyable as Octo Expansion, and I am ultimately glad they mostly went with this direction for Splatoon 3's campaign, but due to the overall structure of the game where you're engaging in the hub world to get to these stages, it does sometimes make the hub world feel as mundane as it did in the last two games. In that regard, Octo Expansion felt very snappy and to the point in comparison. Ultimately, because of Octo Expansion's refined direction, I do ultimately still get a lot more enjoyment out of this than Splatoon 2. This stage here, where you have to destroy all the targets on a grind rail similar to Righteous Rail Station, gave me that same adrenaline pump. Using the new tri-stringer here makes this so much fun. I was super happy when I got this on my first try. Like Octo Expansion, there are no collectibles in the stages themselves, which I am okay with since they are still able to focus on the core challenge for the level design. I think relegating them to the hub world is a lot more interesting since you're already exploring every nook and cranny of that area. This actually means that in terms of the narrative, Sunken Scrolls aren't advanced by level progression this time. However, levels do still assist in the narrative in the form of Alterna logs, where a log for each island is uncovered more and more with the stages you finish, fully unveiling them once you finish every stage in a world. One thing I really like is how much more direct storytelling is in this game. Like the previous games, finishing every boss fight ends with another conversation on the radio, this time to check on Cuttlefish and his whereabouts. Eventually, it's revealed that Mr. Grizz is the one behind all the Fuzzy Ooze nonsense in this adventure. Mr. Grizz, for those who don't know, is the head of the company you work for in the Salmon Run mode to defeat hordes of salmonids and collect golden eggs. So seeing Salmon Run get tied into the game's main story is actually a really fascinating concept. Didn't think Mr. Grizz would want to take over the world with mammalism, but I won't question him. Another thing is, when you reach the end of the first island, the hot new trio Deep Cut introduces themselves into the story. I love how much Callie falls in love with them instantly despite them being at odds. She's so optimistic. But the thing is, yeah, unlike the first two games where the main celebrity group of the game is super friendly and helpful, Deep Cut are actually antagonists in this game. They're after a treasure in Alterna and want to beat us to it and will do everything in their power to not let us get the parts that we receive. Speaking of those parts, every other island has a signal on it that we think is Cuttlefish, so we head there to attempt to rescue him, but it's actually a piece of this machine that is being guarded by Deep Cut. This means that Deep Cut are actually the bosses in this game, which immediately gives each boss far more character than the first two games. Like most Splatoon bosses, they're not really difficult or anything, but I'm far more invested when an actual character is behind these bosses. Fry will attempt to massacre you with her barrage of eels, Shiver rides a freaking shark that will try to chomp you to bits, and Big Man's fight is freaking genius. It is straight up the Manta Storm boss from Super Mario Sunshine. As far back as when the first game released, people immediately made comparisons to Super Mario Sunshine, since the main mechanic revolves around ink in Splatoon, and you shoot fluid projectiles just like in Super Mario Sunshine. So to finally come full circle with this boss is simply incredible. It even has the same color palette for the ink as what the Manta Storm spreads in that boss fight. I freaking love the team who makes these Splatoon games. They have so much fun making video games, I swear. Now, I do have one complaint with this campaign that feels like a nitpick at first, but kind of hinders my enjoyment of it overall when I think more about it. Every main gold kettle level has the exact same background. This does go for the hub worlds as well, since they all take place in the snowy Alterna, but they spice things up a bit there by having islands take place in a power plant, an icy glacier, a ship dock, and even a sunken city. But since the levels themselves aren't designed with as much detail and care as the hub worlds, since they had to make a larger quantity of them with the assets they have, the level design itself can't fully sell the identity of a level. Granted, the silver kettle levels do change the time of day and mess with the background a bit more to help with variety a bit, but the main platforming levels don't get that luxury, and they tend to blend in with one another, which is a shame since every other game and DLC had numerous amounts of different backgrounds. Outer space, tropical pools, tall skyscrapers, vast canyons, amusement parks, the list goes on. Octo Expansion had numerous themes where they were just floating Nintendo controllers and systems, which just really made me happy. I wish that level of background detail was present in 3's campaign. If they wanted to go all out with the ice theme, perhaps they could have experimented with different kinds of frosty locales. Maybe icy waters, the top of a mountain maybe, an icy cave would have done wonders. Even when limiting yourself to one theme, there's a lot you can do to explore that same theme that these levels simply just don't do. This even applies to the secret final level after finishing the campaign. Yeah, I'm gonna talk about this real quick. Instead of a secret boss like in Octo Expansion, they instead decide to make a really lengthy and hard level as the final true challenge. I honestly think this is far more interesting than a secret final boss since it does a far better job of utilizing every skill that you've learned throughout the game instead of how good you are at shooting down players. They definitely take a Champions Road route here from Super Mario 3D World. Every single aspect gets tested to the limit. Numerous do-or-die platforming challenges, unlike anything else in the series, tense uses of the squid form, a rail target section that's really intense. They even utilize the squid roll jump off the wall here to have a little wall jump section, which I wish we saw more of throughout the campaign. It all ends with a large Octoling gauntlet that did take a lot of my lives, but was nowhere near as bad as Inner Agent 3. Again, I wish this had a fully unique background with unique lighting because it blends in with every other main level in the game. But thankfully, the adventure does wrap up in a pretty sick way. Everyone uses the pieces of treasure we gather throughout the game to create a giant weapon for the captain to use to take out the fuzzy barrier blocking the way to the large headquarters. Then the captain powers up in this absolutely insane cutscene where he straight up flies through the air to tear straight through the barrier, and holy crap, this is insane, look at this! And yeah, doing that whole thing tired the mess out of the captain, so he's out for the count. But as we're about to enter the large building, Deep Cut hasn't had quite enough of us yet and tries to reclaim the treasure one last time. But we just give it to them, because we're just that nice, and we don't even need it anymore. They're so flabbergasted that we immediately become friends with them and they help us through the final level. This stage follows the exact same formula as Octo Expansion's final level, but in my opinion, it really isn't as exciting as that. I will give credit that it is interesting listening to the banter between Cuttlefish and Mr. Grizz as you get further through the stage. It does make good use of the small fry in the beginning of the level, and has this really fun sequence with the Zipcaster special. I love this thing, by the way, it's incredibly fun to use in any stage it's in. But thematically, it just doesn't feel as climactic of a stage. Sure, you're inching closer and closer to the rocket where Cuttlefish is, but to me, it just doesn't hit on the same level as making one final risky push to save yourself from being trapped forever in a creepy metro and never seeing sunlight again. Still a good final level though, and the climax is really cool. We're too late to save Cuttlefish, and he gets reduced to this old husky squid form, and he only awakens due to the captain's tear giving him life again. Probably the most horrific thing to visually happen to someone in one of these games. But after that, we get to see just how freaky Mr. Grizz is in the flesh. He's a giant bear as expected, but he's just so intimidatingly large. He just looms over everything. Grizz takes the space on the rocket ship to cover the entire planet in fuzzy ooze, so Deep Cut creates a way for us to launch to space using their eel and shark powers, and then we land on the spaceship to fight the most bizarre final boss in this franchise. We are fighting a giant grizzly bear on a rocket ship in outer space. What can't this franchise do? It decides to integrate salmon run ideas into the single player by making you collect golden eggs to destroy the fuzzy ooze to reach Mr. Grizz to deal damage to his freaky weak points. It's a super weird fight where you have to dodge his bear attacks like claw swipes and roars as he twists the ship trying to get you to run into the fuzzy ooze. By the way, what happens when you do touch that stuff, by the way? I never actually tried it. Got it. After shooting his bear weak points enough times, he blasts us off the ship, where DJ Octavio then catches us to give us ground to fight on, and suddenly the small fry just evolves into a ginormous salmonid and proceeds to engage with Mr. Grizz in a gosh darn kaiju battle? What did the Splatoon team eat? So DJ Octavio teams up with us to use his giant vacuum to pop the giant bear's zits off of Mr. Grizz before he mammalizes the entire planet. You know, as weird as this is, I'm strangely getting Sonic Adventure 2 vibes from this final fight. There's a time limit to save the planet from a threat in outer space, and you're working with the former antagonist to pop the weak points of the final boss. I think I see the inspiration. I will say I was incredibly stupid when I first streamed this game back in 2022 because I didn't know that you were supposed to use the analog stick to control the spaceship you're on to get closer to Mr. Grizz, so I doomed the entire planet by doing that. Guess I wasn't paying attention to the manual. But after finishing off Mr. Grizz, the small fry turns back to normal and we head back down to the planet and the grape zapfish is back where it should be as per usual. Splatoon 3's campaign doesn't reach the highs of Octo Expansion, but I'd say it offers the best base game single-player experience. It fumbles in a certain amount of areas that previous campaigns were able to avoid, but definitely makes up for it with the increased character and a wonderful spectacle. If Splatoon 3 is the only Splatoon game that you buy and play, I'd say you're pretty set with the franchise. Though I am going to be a bit brutally honest for a moment and take a step back from all this. As a player that invested hundreds of hours into Splatoon 2, was Splatoon 3 really a necessary game in the year 2022? The improvements from Splatoon 2 to Splatoon 3 are a far greater leap in quality than Splatoon 1 to Splatoon 2, yet despite the gap in between games being the largest in the series, I was honestly baffled by this release when it first launched. I had a good time with the campaign, but taking a look outside of it, there were so many problems that this game had regarding the rest of the package at launch than either two games. When playing the multiplayer, I had an unfathomable amount of disconnects from online matches that turned me away from the game for a lengthy period of time. On top of that, when 3 launched, it had less content than 2 did after its updates wrapped up, which wouldn't be an issue if 3 was on an entirely different console, but at that point in time, I wanted to just play Splatoon 2 instead, thanks to it having a lot more content and having a more stable connection. This significant lack of polish the game had in the beginning made me question at the time if I even had interest in the franchise anymore. A solid single player and a $60 multiplayer package at the time wasn't enough to bring me back into the series on the same system. We do live in an age now where Splatoon 3 is the most refined entry in the series and is more than worth the money now, but it didn't feel that way at launch. It honestly felt like the result of a cash grab despite the devs putting a ton of heart into the actual product. If you ask me now what I think of Splatoon 3, I think it's a must-have for the Switch, but if you asked me what I thought of it in 2022, I would have said I was pretty let down. To continue speaking about what sort of mood I was in after Splatoon 3 released and when the DLC was announced, I simply didn't really care about Splatoon anymore. To me, it had fallen into the same pit that so many other modern multiplayer games never seem to crawl out of. Lack of polish, little content on release, and a weird sense of FOMO like the different seasons with exclusive rewards. In that February 2023 Direct, I had no idea what to expect from Splatoon's second paid DLC announcement, but to my surprise, we had a double pack. I was pretty intrigued at first when seeing them tease the Inkopolis from the first game. Perhaps we'd be getting a port of the Splatoon 1 campaign in the Splatoon 3 engine? That'd be fascinating. Well, no, it's just the hub world. I was gobsmacked at the time. This justifies half of the expansion pass? I didn't even bother, but luckily right after that they teased the second wave of the expansion pass, this new, seemingly dark and mind-bending campaign called Side Order. While I was intrigued, it wasn't enough for me to pre-order the expansion pass when no release window was provided for the real meat of the package. There's no way I was gonna shell out $25 for an alternate hub world for a game I was already conflicted on. Turns out, I was conflicted for quite a while, as Side Order fell very deep into my backlog. I haven't even purchased or touched Side Order until this very video. I wasn't super invested when I saw the actual gameplay trailer for Side Order, since it was revealed that it's a roguelike. One thing to know about me. I suck at roguelikes, but I will treat the genre with respect as there are so many fantastic games out there with the genre, but I am the opposite of an expert, though I have played my bits of Hades, Binding of Isaac, and Enter the Gungeon, so you'll have to bear with me as I discuss this. Now, despite everything I just said, I'll go ahead and cut to the chase. Is Side Order a worthy addition to the Splatoon campaign roster? Well, there are two sides you can view it in. If you're viewing through the lens of this being a Splatoon adventure, Side Order is a very intriguing and replayable experience with incredible art direction, some of the most addicting gameplay in the series, and loads of fan service with great scenes and compelling backstories. In that regard, I really like it. On the other side of the chip though, viewing this as a roguelike, it feels underbaked in a number of areas and doesn't live up to the extensiveness of some of the all-time greats for similar, if not lower prices. You can try to justify this being a simple side addition to the expansion pass when paired with the Inkopolis hub world wave, but nah, admit it, you're buying the expansion pass for Side Order. To go ahead and set things up, Agent 8 from Octo Expansion wakes up in a mysteriously sinister world where Pearl is turned into a drone and the two have to go up to find Marina in a weirdly digital version of the spire from Inkopolis Square. When entering the tower, we meet Oct, who goes way back with Marina and decides to assist us with finding her. Okay, I really need to gush about the art direction real quick because it's noticeable right from the start. It is absolutely fantastic. I adore the mix of peach colors throughout the game, with the color palette remaining very cotton candy-esque. The digital models doing these bizarre duplication animations really sells the digital atmosphere, and watching the levels render into existence is a brilliant way of building up the tension of loading up a new stage. They even nailed the sound direction. A lot of menu noises sound like mouse clicks and typing on an office keyboard, and even swimming through ink has this glitchy sandpaper-like sound to it that isn't anything like the main game. But yes, we're making our way through the tower and learning how the roguelike mechanics work as we go, doing relatively easy levels along the way. When reaching the top floor in the control room, we find where Marina is being held captive and controlled by Order. And we have an entirely unique and pretty freaky boss fight with her that is fascinatingly rhythm-based with the way her projectiles shoot out. A really solid first boss, and upon defeating her, Order gets fully realized and we get blasted out of the tower. Oh my god, that was just the intro. What a way to start the game. When waking up, Marina shows us what's happening as we're in a VR world called the Memverse, intended to help numerous Octolings, but has gone haywire thanks to the virus that is Order. Thanks to a thing called grayscaling, Order plans to make everyone in the real world lose their minds and their wills, so we need to make it to the top of the newly enhanced spire to destroy Order. One thing that's really fascinating about this DLC's existence is that it helps provide us with an alternate look into what Splatoon 3's theme could have been like if Order won the final Splatoon 2 Splatfest. Granted, I will say that a complaint of mine is that the theme isn't as dark as the teaser trailer for the DLC made it out to be. The tone and music of that teaser really made it seem like this was going to be a mind-bending experience with a very complex dive into Order as a concept. In the actual DLC, Order and a lack of freedom is just kind of the flavor of the adventure, with a hint of VR tying the incredible art direction together. Alright, enough procrastinating. There are 30 floors of the spire to climb, each offering a random challenge of a certain variety. Unlike every other campaign, the focus has heavily shifted to combat inside Order. There are next to no platforming challenges in sight, and the game solely tests you with enemy hordes and standing your ground. Levels are even more bite-sized than Octo Expansion to help with the pacing of a roguelike. You'll guide 8 balls to their destination with no threat of them falling, protect splat zones, destroy gelatin portals, guide a turbine to the goal, defeat fleeing enemies, and defeat bosses. Get used to all those tasks because that's all you'll be seeing for the whole game. The floors get increasingly harder the higher you go up, so before entering every floor, you'll have a choice of what floor you get to go to alongside what chip you'll be able to add to your palette. Chips here are the primary stat boosters and extra perks you'll gain on your way to the top. The chip color represents what kind of perk it'll offer, but they can range from increased fire rate, damage, range, improved ink recovery, chances of item drops, increasing the size of the literal, actual hitbox of ink, which is a genius design choice, adding weapons to Pearl's drone, and how frequently they can charge, and so much more. I will say that how useful certain chips are do depend on what weapon you pick for the run, meaning that some could be potentially useless for said run, but later in the run some floors will have a bonus perk or a danger perk. Bonuses are usually challenges that reward you with more coins upon completion, like beating the room without using the glide mechanic with the drone, not moving in Octoling form, refraining from using your main weapon, and a lot more. But sometimes you'll get an overflow of chips of a specific type to absolutely blast through a room, basically a free win. Danger floors will make the floor harder in some way. The lights can go out, the ground can be turfed in enemy ink, enemies can get a massive buff, the drone will become inaccessible. They can really be a pain in the neck and ruin runs at times. Makes me only want to get them out of the way so that way more of them don't show up later. But man, some of these chips are real godsends. Going over my favorites, Lucky Bomb Drop is a must-have for any run. Gaining and stacking these chips will increase their effect, and thus your chances of a small bomb dropping upon defeating an enemy in this case. And when you have a crazy amount of luck, you can watch an entire army of gelatins explode as you barely even shoot at them. Poison ink, also a must-have, literally damages enemies that touch your ink, and combined with hindrance damage and sticky ink will turn your ink turf into a full-on safe zone that no one can enter. Always nice to occasionally grab these disc drop upgrades, since collecting 3 disc pieces in a level will cause Pearl to temporarily block all enemy portals and create a shockwave that sends enemies flying away, giving you a massive opportunity to make a comeback on the level if you're in a bind. The amount of dopamine this creates when I get to crack open entire armies of foes makes for some of the most addicting gameplay of all the single players. Reaching the top can be quite daunting, with the threat of starting the entire run over if you die once, so Marina comes in to offer permanent hacks at the cost of pearls you get along your run. If you're simply trying to finish the game and see the experience to the end, going for these hacks will make the experience significantly more doable if all you care about is overcoming the spire with the limitations you set for yourself. That being said, a full run of Side Order isn't very long, as you run through 30 overall floors with 2 regular bosses and face the final fight against Order that is one of the most advanced battles in the series, with challenging attack patterns to dodge with a really creepy and intense atmosphere. On the first run, the game ends with a climactic version of the... The game ends with the climactic version of the final battle, where Order initially corrupts the world, but with the rhythmic beat in our heart, we power up and use the power of DJ to power up to the max and send Order back to the backlog. I gotta give props for giving first-time finishers an exciting and climactic ending to celebrate the end of the first run. Beating the shit out of Order to a remix of Ebb and Flow is a real treat. But as with any roguelike, this game is meant to be played over and over, so we're not exactly finished with this. And it's where coming back to Side Order for repeat playthroughs starts to show the cracks in this experience. Don't you worry, this game wants you to play it over and over again thanks to the locker system, where beating floor 10, 20, and 30 with each weapon will grant you a key for each of those floors. These will unlock more weapons, diary entries with Marie and Oct, and rewards outside of Side Order. There is a reason to play Side Order several times, but the more times I run through Side Order, the more I question the desire to play Side Order several times. I'll give credit to the devs for making more unique backgrounds in this than the base game Splatoon 3, so the visual variety doesn't get stale for how short a run it is. But it does not take long before you start running into the exact same challenges and rooms. One of the most gripping things about roguelikes, such as The Binding of Isaac, is that every time you finish a run, something entirely new is added to the game, whether it be different level designs, new bosses, and even new routes for endings and brand new final bosses that make you immediately want to do another run. In Hades, new forms of the main bosses will start appearing throughout the game, and the ending slightly changes for each new run, which really ups the emotional tension every time you finish the game. Side Order's levels can not only all be seen in just a few runs, albeit with different challenges on occasion, but including the tutorial boss and the final boss, there are only 5 bosses in Side Order. 3 of them are only thrown into floor 10 and 20 at random. Credit where credit is due, that's more original bosses than Octo Expansion had to offer, but in a game as replayable as a roguelike, the run variety is not very high. All the bosses are decent, but sometimes seeing that same damn stupid ball gets really tiring. I do realize that this is some harsh criticism for a DLC, and this would be phenomenal if it was like a $15 DLC, but for $25, this is a fun experience, but it pales in comparison to the other stellar roguelikes on the market. As a Splatoon fan, however, this really is quite fun. You could argue that comparing it to other roguelikes isn't fair or doesn't really work for Splatoon, but I really just say that because there's a lot of potential with this campaign that I don't feel they fully realized. What's here is flat out addicting though. I can see myself coming back and doing runs of this if I ever want to pass the time or get a nice satisfying Splatoon kick in without the stress of online multiplayer. There aren't a lot of unique assets to this, but what's here showcases a vast variety of ways to play the game. Using different weapons will change the way you approach combat tenfold with these gelatins, and if you really want to challenge yourself, turning off all the hacks will put you in a very thrilling experience. This is probably fun as shit to speedrun as well with how short this is. This is where my two sides of the coin argument comes into full effect. It's a fantastic Splatoon DLC, but lackluster for roguelike standards. I would much rather replay this than any of the main game campaigns, but maybe that isn't entirely fair due to the replayable nature of this. I just really love the theming going on here with the VR aesthetics and the appealing color tone. That being said, I really hope this roguelike direction isn't what they're gonna go for in Splatoon 4. I think this being a side order works perfectly. It doesn't go all the way, but it sticks out from the other campaigns in ways that makes it special in its own way. For a while, I really couldn't find my stance on this series. I was tired of it by the time Splatoon 3 first dropped. but replaying these campaigns has helped me rekindle my love for this series that I thought was gone. It's present through even the single-player offerings that this franchise has character, world-building, attention to detail, and creative concepts that no other company can offer. From Splatoon 1 giving me the fresh new perspective on a hot new world, to Side Order refining the elegant character and addicting gameplay, Splatoon sits right next to every other major Nintendo IP. Whether it's regarded as a multiplayer juggernaut or a major single-player Nintendo release. There have been spots where the gameplay got a little stale and repetitive through Splatoon 2 and 3's campaign, but this team has proven that they can get right back up and invent new explosions of fun to be had from this franchise. I'm at a point where I am once again excited to play whatever the next Splatoon game that comes out is, and that is a pretty fresh feeling.